Hello and welcome. I'm Zilla, and this is my Athenaeum. Today we'll be discussing whether Jews are white. This is the third in a multi-part series on Jewish identity, and if you'd like to start at the beginning, you can click the card above, or follow the links in the doobly-doo below. Whether or not Jews are white is not so straightforward a question as it might at first seem. For some Jews, the answer is very clearly no. There is a large and growing percentage of the population of at least North American Jews who also identify as people of color for some other reason, especially Black or Hispanic. In a recent poll, there was an age division, and the oldest age bracket had only about 7% of people identifying as people of color, but in the youngest bracket it was up to 28%. So clearly you can be both Jewish and, let's say, Black, and you can be discriminated against for both those things at the same time. And it seems straightforward on its face for you to come to the conclusion that anti-Semitism therefore just can't be racism, because these are clearly not the same experience. But racism and other forms of discrimination don't fall cleanly into easily separable categories. You can be both Black and Hispanic, for example, and experience racism on two fronts there, and it would be ludicrous to tell somebody that one of those two can't possibly be racism. So, if we decide to categorize anti-Judaic prejudice as racism, we really have to acknowledge that different forms of racism, like anti-Blackness and anti-Asian bias and anti-Indigenous bias and so on, are all just different flavors of the same hate-fueled energy drink. Just because there are Jews of color, though, doesn't mean that so-called white Jews are immune from prejudice against those people of color. Even within the Jewish community, where people have regularly experienced anti-Semitism, it's distressingly common to find anti-Black racism. It's not all that surprising when you think about it. People who are treated by society as white are likely to perpetuate other stereotypes that society looks down upon in order to maintain their status. And even if they don't mean to do it, it's really easy to pick up the norms of an anti-Black society. Even as the percentage of North American Jews of color grows, there are still a lot of people who think that Jews look somewhere between how I look and how the cartoons look. And even among the Jewish community, many have never met a Jew of color, or perhaps they've only met a Black Hebrew Israelite. They don't expect to see Black people in their synagogue or have Asian Jews in their family. They assume that anybody who is a person of color must be a convert, not really of the race. And that leads to children raised in the faith who happen to be people of color getting almost gaslit by the community that should be accepting them. You can't possibly be a Jew if you're a Black child, because how could you have converted? But the Jewish diaspora is much wider than just North America and other largely white-populated places these days. As early as the 3rd century CE, we have records of a strong Jewish population in Ethiopia. In fact, although I'm still just learning about their history, this group, known as Beta Israel, or the Community of Israel, Beta from the same root as Bait in Hebrew, they used to have their own kingdom. They conquered Aksum, they reigned for many generations, until the Christians came and dethroned them, enslaved and scattered them. These days, the Beta Israel population is relatively small, and many of them emigrated to Israel as soon as its doors were opened in 1977. But just because there are Black African Jews doesn't mean that anti-Black racism doesn't affect them in other parts of the world. Even in Israel, where they are acknowledged as part of the Jewish race for purposes of emigration, the more Middle Eastern or white Jews tend to look down on them as a community and as a group. And other Jews around the diaspora have this ingrained anti-Black racism too. Don't even get me started on South African white Jews and Black apartheid. And as long as we're talking about more Middle Eastern Jews, there are plenty of Mizrahi or Arabic descent and Sephardic or Spanish descent Jews who do not pass for white the way an Ashkenazi might. They look much like any other Middle Easterner, and the divide between Arab and Jew is more of a Venn diagram. It's hard to imagine anybody claiming that a Jew who looks Arabic coming into the US wouldn't get painted with the brush of Islamophobia. So there are a lot of Jews who are simply not white, not by any measure. Whether you are asking about being otherwise of color, coming from Africa or the Middle East, they're just not white, not at all. But that's not really what you were asking, was it? Come on now. Don't be coy. You're really thinking about Ashkenazi Jews, like me, with our maybe red hair and glib tongue. Jews who just look kind of European. So am I white? Depends who's asking. Question 1. Do white passing Jews count as white for purposes of privilege? To answer this question, though, we first have to define what whiteness is. And that's no simple task. Historically speaking, race as divided by color is not really a thing until about 1600 CE. This was the Enlightenment era. Yeah, really. In which a lot of scientists and scholars started looking back to Greek philosophers like Aristotle to learn how to move forward with their understanding of human nature. One of the things that Aristotle famously loved to do, and wrongly so, was to categorize everything. His taxonomies don't divide people by skin color, but for the Enlightenment era Europeans, this seemed like the natural thing to do. So, white Europeans at the top of the pile, down through yellow Asians and red natives to Black Africans at the bottom. This kind of thinking that you can tell something real about a person, their relative intelligence or other deep qualities by their superficial characteristics, is known as scientific racism. Because there is nothing real about race. To quote Michael Harriot, the great white race is as real as a mermaid riding a unicorn on a dragon, listening to dope lyrics from Lil Uzi. Race is a social construct, and we could just as easily be divided up by what language we speak or what culture we're from. And indeed, in ancient Greece and Rome, this is more or less what happened. Not entirely, but if I delved into that right now, this would be a whole other video. So, suffice it to say that there's nothing natural or inherent about skin tone as a marker of distinction between different kinds of people. In fact, what white encompasses has shifted a lot over the centuries, and not just because of mixed race descendants of white rapists and their enslaved people of color. You might be surprised to learn, for instance, that as recently as 100 years ago, North America didn't consider Italians and Greeks, for instance, to be white. There are Italian and Greek Americans today who grew up being considered black due to their Southern European heritage and olive skin tone. It seems beyond belief that white people would claim the heritage of ancient Greece and Rome while denying status to the actual real-world descendants, but Eastern Europeans were also often not considered white. As Brandon Starkey writes, really the only people who counted as white up to 100 years ago were the English, the Dutch, the Scandinavians, Germans, maybe the French. The Irish cemented their status as white maybe 50 years earlier because they sided very hard against black liberation. All of which is to say that whiteness is a category where the lines between what is white and what is not shift and change with societal perception. Whiteness, much to everybody's detriment, is defined as the racial category without racial markers. So let's ask that question again. Are Jews, light-skinned, white-passing Jews, really white? Am I, a white-passing Jew with very few of the physical markers that people associate with Jews, am I white? In many ways, I have to say yes. If I'm filling out the census, they don't have a box under race for Jewish, and while I could tick other and write it in, what they're really looking for is, yeah, I'm white. And, frankly, I pass. If I'm walking down the street, nobody is going to look at me and wonder what country I'm from. No one is going to listen to my voice and think of me as other. I look, and in many ways act and think, white. In much of the white world, therefore, I just am white. I pass right over the hurdles that a lot of Black and Asian and other folks have to deal with every day. I'm not going to get pulled over just because of my skin tone. No one's going to call the cops on me for having a party in my backyard. I can even weaponize my white womanhood to have people bow and scrape to me, although I try to use that power only for good. But in other ways, I can never really be white. When a white person finds out that I'm Jewish for the first time, there's always this moment, a recalibration. It's never been as bad as, say, the way that some Japanese people react upon finding out someone they otherwise like is Korean, but it's definitely different, not something that other white people seem to experience. And it's not because of my personality or what I worship, because, like I said, I'm non-religious. It's about my heritage. So, is that race? I'm not sure what else to call it. It's certainly not the same as anti-Black racism, but until Jews stop being the other, the best I've got for our Jews white is only until someone notices they aren't. Question 2. Are Jews exempt from being targets of white supremacy because they might pass as white? No. I mean, we've already looked at the easy part of this question. Any white supremacist group that centers the protocols propaganda is going to see Jews as an evil other race. And anyone buying into the sort of subsidiary conspiracy theories like globalist banking or international Jewry is obviously not going to see Jews as white. There are white supremacist and nationalist groups all over the world who bank on making this distinction, that Jews are not white or not a part of them. There was Greece's Golden Dawn Party, which thankfully has been recently recategorized as a terrorist group, but also German ADF, France's Front National, which I think has been renamed to Rassemblement National, Orban's party in Hungary, Erdogan's in Turkey. There are groups in Austria, Australia, Russia. Anywhere that this distinction can be meaningfully made, someone loud and angry is trying to make it. We've already talked some about American black anti-Semitism, usually spurred in religious organizations like the Nation of Islam, the Black Hebrew Israelites, or even some sects of black Christianity. The belief there is that Jews are somehow worse than the white man. Almost, I've heard it called hyper-white. After all, the white man just wants to enslave your body, but the Jew wants to manipulate your soul. And this is definitely behind some of the reactions I've gotten over the years. I'll never forget the day that a group of my classmates, teenagers of color, collectively got up the nerve to send somebody to ask me, "So you're Jewish, right? Does that mean you worship the devil?" And then I turned our PE class into an impromptu comparative religions study. But that's just the innocence. They didn't know any better. They were curious. I've spoken more than once to a man rather high up in the Nation of Islam organization, and over time it became clear to me that he saw me and mine as the enemy, as people who were inherently trying to manipulate him, and who he had the right to manipulate right back. One of his cronies at one point sent a professional email referring to a relative of mine as a blue-eyed devil. This is that double valence again. Hyper-white, both white and worse. Of course, I can't skip over the Arabic world. The tensions there are built on a foundation of racism, of complex political power dynamics, of many years of war and strife, religious conflict, killings, and terrible misunderstandings. I can't untangle it all right now. I'll talk about a lot of it later. Suffice to say that despite the existence of many Arabic and Middle Eastern Jews, Mizrahi Jews, some Sephardic Jews, etc., many Arab political factions, even news outlets, paint Jews as inherently blood and bone different from not only Arabs but also white people. And like I mentioned before, even in North America, groups that are considered white now weren't necessarily always so, including the Jews. Up until 1944, when news of the death camps in the Holocaust became too much to ignore, the US was routinely turning away Jewish refugees. And their reasons why will sound really familiar to anyone who was paying attention to Trump-era Islamophobia. Headlines from US and Canadian newspapers, even quotes from FDR himself, refer to Jews as alien, as having dangerous religion, being dirty and foreign and not able to assimilate. They might harbor terrorists among them, and we can only let so many in. There's also plenty of quieter, more individual racism. let's take a story that a friend told me just a few years ago. He had taken a 23andMe test and found out that somewhere up the line there was a very small percentage of Ashkenazi Jew. When he told his mother, who lives out in the Midwest, she begged him not to be public about it, because she knew it would mark their whole family as lesser in her neighbor's eyes. That's not about religion or even culture. That's the one-drop rule. There are also plenty of ways Jews are discriminated against on a day-to-day basis that have pretty ambiguous sources. Is it racism that makes so many Christians and ex-Christian atheists treat Jews like some kind of lesser version of Christians? Or is it that they just deep down believe we're going to hell and have to tell us in the most patronizing way possible? Look, I've heard this argument from liberals and leftists, from progressives, and even from Jews, that anti-Semitism can't be a kind of racism because Judaism isn't a race. Jews are a religion, an ethnic group, a culture. But I hope that I've shown by now that this kind of distinction is not easily made. Race isn't sufficiently delineated from those other categories that it's a claim that bears a lot of weight. What it reminds me of is this argument that you'll hear from Richard Dawkins and people like him who claim that Islamophobia isn't racist because they just hate Islam, the religion, not Muslims or Arabs, the people. And then they turn right around and talk about people from that part of the world like they're vermin. It's impossible to detangle the fear of Jewish heritage from the fear of the heathen when it comes to hatred and discrimination. So are Jews white? Well, are we?